Good morning, everybody. I must say congratulations, Tim. A very interesting and encouraging presentation, which I must say has done quite a bit to, in some ways, meet and mitigate some of the rather more somber things which I think I ought to try to bring to general discussion today. I've been working now 56 years in the music world, and I think I'm very much sort of hardwired towards optimism and sort of an idea that you can always overcome almost every difficulty. But as I contemplate the prospects of what we all share together here in the still lingering and uncertain COVID world, I find myself unusually conflicted about this optimism. And indeed, what I thought I would do was to just pinpoint all of the, or some of the many worries which concern me very deeply at the moment. It's sort of obvious to list the sort of flagship issues which we are going to be facing, we have faced and we will continue to face. Well, climate change, obviously, sustainability, both in terms of the physical and also the aspirational side of what we aim to do. Diversity and inclusion, yes, again, it's so obvious that what we try to do, which is maybe one of the great achievements of humankind, is that we have created over 250 or more years this extraordinary world of symphonic and other music. And yet we share it with such a tiny percentage of the people who actually also pay for it, the taxpayers. In my view, great danger of increases in a very inward-looking nationalism and xenophobia, a serious lack of credibility amongst politicians and taxpayers who are still quite amazingly ignorant about actually what we all do and how many people around the world participate enthusiastically and actively in music making. The uncertainties of further variants in infection, viruses, spikes of one kind or another, political fears of being held responsible for a short-term setback, the ever-growing danger about the diminishing credibility of information, the probability, in my view, of substantially reduced subsidies and funding in the future, not maybe immediately. And linked to that are also huge differences between neighboring states in terms of where funding comes from, what degree of support is considered to be appropriate for cultural and musical institutions, not to mention also the individual lives of self-employed, independent artists of all kinds. To this already daunting list, I would also like to add that I fear very much the impact of inflation. I fear most of all the huge increase in migrancy, probably millions of people escaping wars, famine, authoritarianism of one kind or another, and maybe even disease. And also, of course, the political acceleration in disharmony amongst the major global powers and everywhere between rich and poor. So one of the things that I think is central to a better way forward is a review of what the responsibility of leadership is. There will be no comfortable and easy return to things as they were before the pandemic. Tim has given very, very good examples of how a wonderfully agile organization like the LSO has adapted itself so successfully in so many different ways, but faces, in a way, every few months a new challenge which changes the model in which the orchestra has been accustomed to work for so many decades. So in a way, what I still don't see anywhere enough of is the bringing together of major leaders in the cultural sector working together to bring about change, to accept the fact that change has to come, and to commit themselves to changing the institutions which they are responsible for. I mean, in some ways, COP is a very interesting example on a sort of macro level, because one can talk about reducing carbon and all these other things with a time table. But the fact is that unless you get much more deep into the roots of the problem, the targets will probably never be achieved because there are too many forces which are militating against them. So where do I still find some grounds for optimism? I think there is a fragile, but there is a sense of the values which we have taken for granted coming back into focus as being something essential to our lives, and of bringing out the incredible treasures which have evolved and which are there for us to benefit from and to benefit society from, if only we have the will to do so. But also to be able to find ways of making sure that these treasures are shared with much wider constituencies, so that they are included in the process and not excluded and looking in from outside. I think that this needs, in terms again of the leadership and the forward view, if you like, this needs a very, very fundamental understanding or attempt to understand how society is developing. I think we cannot assume anymore that it will be acceptable that those people who live, only those people, or mostly only those people who live in big conurbations, have access to the best in arts and in creative lives. And I think that the trend now is people wanting not to be bound into rigid office working in central cities, but and what people have discovered about what they can do with more time to themselves in more sustainable environments. I think this is going to have a tremendous impact both on audiences, on motivation, and also on the opportunity of bringing people into what we all enjoy and so many other people don't. I think that there will be a fundamental change in the buildings and venues in which music and the arts can be at their most life-enhancing, and that we will have to find much better solutions in terms of devising new formats to get away from, finally, the still amazingly persistent 19th century bourgeois view of art being available to an elite audience, in a way, all facing one way, looking at the people performing on the stage. This, I think, is just not sustainable. And in a way, one of the great benefits of the expansion of the digital world is that it has actually enabled us to challenge this view. It's enabled us to change the whole perspective of who is looking at who and who is actually creating the artistic experience. And I think, therefore, that those people who And there is a tendency, I've noticed already now, there is a tendency for institutions to start to row back on the availability of digital performance because they're afraid that it might adversely affect the return to ticket buying. What I think has to be invested in and understood, and I'm happy to see that LSO is doing such a great job in this respect, is that the digital world has the tremendous possibility of complementarity, of building, of actually transferring to a global audience the work that is done at home or in some cases on tour. And I think that one of the things that we will need to agree upon is this idea about exclusivity. And indeed, when Tim was referring to the idea of artists being in prolonged periods of residence, I sort of smiled a bit myself because over the last 25 years, I have been fighting constantly those people, and I have to say it used to also be the LSO, who insisted that you had to have exclusivity over an artist and that it was better that an artist appeared only once every 2 years in a major city, and that if there was going to be a chamber music performance, it would have to be in another part of the season. And I've always thought this was complete nonsense, because in fact the public doesn't have that sort of long-term memory. They want to have a very intensive engagement with the artists and the music that they like. And the more you concentrate, the more you share, the more you cooperate between venues, between other art forms, the better your prospects are to build up the loyalties which we all need so desperately. I mean, I am personally very, very much interested in the potential of cross-arts projects, because we in a way need to share much larger audiences that any particular art form has by itself. And this, I think, is eminently achievable. I think it brings into a very, very interesting new perspective the creative work of very, very high-profile creative artists. And I think that, for instance, it's interesting that the Concertgebouw Orchestra has made an engagement with Pierre Audi as a creative partner, not as a performer, but as a sort of concept artist. And I think that that's a very, very interesting project. And I hope that other orchestras and institutions might borrow that idea. There's no copyright, after all, in ideas. So I think we need to work much more closely together. We need to share audiences. We need to think about what I described as cluster planning, which again, Tim referred to. So I think that, I mean, I find it sort of incredible that it's not possible to base an orchestra in an area where there is within 100 kilometers, there are maybe 5, 6, 10 larger cities. I find it incredible that it's not possible to work out projects whereby an orchestra can be resident and that their activities can be shared in a very structured way amongst a number of different presenters. Therefore, creating mini festivals, also giving the opportunity to motivate our respective staffs to share much more widely the knowledge, expertise, data, which we all accumulate in our own different ways, to motivate the media much more, to take it seriously, to create a far better platform for lobbying, a far more convincing case to engage with politicians, a far better way of explaining what are the key core essential values of music and the arts and performance. I have sometimes referred to a book which I read about 2 years ago by the German forester Peter Wohlleben, called The Hidden Life of Trees. which I found a very wonderful metaphor for what we need to do and need to understand better about our shared our cultural heritage, very different cultural heritage, it should also be said. I mean, his principle is that you cannot sustain a healthy nature or what you like, a natural superstructure on the planet if you don't take care of the root system, if you don't understand better how roots work, how fungi work, how nature messages within its different organisms better solutions. And I see that as being so very similar to what we should be expecting from and what we should be building in the way that we give added value to the cultural and creative world. Because that seems to me is the shortcut to a far greater degree of potential inclusion, fairness, working together, education, well-being, mental health, all of those things. And that will also enable us to have more power with the short-termism of politicians who are, after all, going to be, and I predict this with great concern, they are going to be robbing cultural budgets. Not maybe this year, maybe not next year, but I'm absolutely certain that when the next round of major elections comes along, especially if some of the other things are turning sour, there will be very strong attempts to cut back on the investment behind culture because it will be perceived by politicians as not being vote catching. So if we don't all stand up together, if we don't put our heads above the parapet, not worry so much about being punished because we speak our minds, if we can only collectively engage with the business of making it more obviously accountable that without music, culture, education, opportunity, access, our societies are going to be more and more fragmented. There will be more anger, which is also a very dangerous element in society. There will be more feeling of neglect and poverty. All of these things seem to me to be issues which flow from a very, very public and a very, very concentrated engagement with the values which we, probably everyone here in the room, takes for granted. I would say that there are also some really interesting, I've seen some very interesting initiatives recently. One of the most moving ones for me was in Paris at the Philharmonie, where there was just about 3 weeks ago, was the Philharmonie des Enfants was opened. And as far as I know, it's the first, to me, really convincing program for bringing children from 4 to 10 into a real engagement with what the values of music and art are. It's brilliantly done. It's a sort of labyrinth of fun and games, but all about music. And it also gives such a sort of sense of empowerment to young children as to what they can do. And also, and this is, I think, very much the initiative of Laurent Bayle, who has just stood down as being the general director of the Philharmonie. He's also been hugely influential in developing the whole network of demos, orchestras and musical groups all around the country. And these things, I think, are incredibly important in terms of, again, engaging with areas where there is no provision. And symphony orchestras often have all of the skills And sometimes they are doing excellent work in that field already, but they have all of the skills in order to know how to promote activity, not just for themselves, but for others. Now, I also want to ask myself, and ask you to think, why actually do orchestras tour? I mean, is it really actually necessary? What are the gains of it? Well, there are some obvious ones. If you have a very intensive period of working together, this tends to promote excellence. And it also tends to promote a sort of integrated style, house style. It's clearly, obviously motivating in terms of local support because of the maybe sometimes dubious value of international recognition. It's often driven by the ambitions of management or of chief conductors, of sponsors, media companies, etc. But maybe there are other ways of achieving those ambitions, like just being better, doing more for your own community and society, bringing more people into connection with what orchestras do. In some cases, but less and less, of course, it produced additional income. I mean, particularly, of course, in the London orchestra market, which were, because of the generally Philistine neglect of what I would describe as the crucial responsibility of institutional building, which every government should have at the heart of its national policy, and which we in Britain, unfortunately, with our successive, ever more Philistine governments, don't do. But in a way, of course, it's developed an extraordinary agility amongst the British orchestras and groups and musicians, and in a way, they have become absolutely expert at exporting debt. They take their wonderful quality performances to places where the money is. But that, as Tim has also pointed out, this is incredibly precarious now, first of all, because of all of the, precarious because of all of the increased limitations and difficulties, but also because I think that there will be more and more resistance to others coming into your market, so to speak. That, I think, is very, very dangerous. But anyway, I'll finish up because there's much more I could say, but one of the things I think that needs also to be done is there has to be a restoration of trust. Trust between institutions, artists, managers, and the society in which we are. That trust has been tremendously eroded by what we have gone through in COVID. Thank you.